Welcome back to the New Levels Coaching Podcast. Remember, we are the endurance podcast that brings the endurance world lots of coaching, inspiration, and education so you can literally go away and run with it. As always, I'm your host, Lewis Moses, and this week I am joined by a good friend of mine, sport and business psychologist Stuart Holliday. And he joins the podcast for the very first time in a virtual setting. So you're the first guest, Stu, as we discussed, to join a virtual setting. And it's fair to say we had a few tech issues getting set up, but we're here
Yeah.
now. And hopefully I
Hmm.
could hear you and you could hear me.
Crystal clear.
Perfect, which means we are good to go. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Stu, and then I'm going to ask him to introduce himself to our listeners, just to give everybody a little bit more background about Stu himself. He is a runner. He is an endurance runner. I believe still running for Charlton Harriers over there, Manchester way, Stu.
Chiltern runners. I need to go second claim. I've been in London for a few years, back at Victoria Park, Harriers. But yeah, running really is taking a bit of a backseat to childcare, but I squeeze in whatever I can.
So yes, Charlton runners up there in Manchester, but yes, Stu is based over, or certainly down in the south as well, and he does travel around the UK as well as the world, practicing his sport and business psych. And I guess that's what I liked about working with Stu in particular, was that he has that experience of the running world. It was something that I was familiar with when I worked with Stu, both from a coaching perspective as well as a business perspective. Stu also has recently published a book, which he'll tell you a little bit more about. And it's all to do with the psychology of running, which I think is fascinating. And our conversation today will not just look at the psychology of running and working on your mindset, it's also going to look at how the psychology of running can maybe have a wider impact on your life, your well-being, and also your work in a positive way. And that's where our conversation is going to go. But before we go into that, Stu, I'm going to ask you to give the listeners a little bit of a background information about yourself, where your journey started in the sport and business psych world, and where you are now.
Great. Well, thanks for the lovely introduction, Lewis, and thanks for having me on today. It's a real privilege to be on New Levels Coaching Podcast. I've known you now for a good few years, and we've always shared knowledge, best practice, and our crossover with the worlds of elite sport. And we both are business owners ultimately. My background, very briefly for listeners, that's relevant to what we're discussing today is I wasn't really much of an athlete in my youth, not like Lewis, who was, tearing up the cross country scene. I was someone who was always active and playing outside, and parents really encouraging me to participate in sport. I'd go to primary school with a football attached to me. We'd play football before school, at break time, at lunchtime, after school. We weren't necessarily great, but what we lacked in talent, we made up for in enthusiasm. Some may say that's sort of a bit like my running, uh, but not wanting to be too self-deprecating. I'm passionate about sport, always have been. Dad was motor racer in his youth, so I kind of grew up on the motor racing circuit as well as cycle tracks and running tracks. Where it's relevant to the listener, I was doing psychology at Manchester as my degree when I was coming out of high school, and then I went and worked in business for a while, for about 10 years, and had a really good career. Really enjoyed what I did, but I wasn't ready to go into the world of any kind of psychology, whether that was clinical, educational, or in, as it turned out, sport. But I was doing more and more sporting activity. I joined an athletics group. I was working with a coach called Chris Czar, who still coaches down at Mile End Track in East London. And he was really generous with like saying, come and learn from me about what coaching on track looks like. And there was a really talented pool of runners there, like Perry Shapes Drayton and Levon Yarwood, back in the days before the London Olympics. And I was building up my master's in specializing in sports psychology. So I had that. And I was really fortunate after the London Games. Steve Peters had made a name for himself working with the British cycling team and had people he was supervising working in taekwondo and in canoeing. So I was able to be brought on into his team as they got more work post games, and I was sent to work in UK archery and GB swimming for the Paralympic squad. And I just worked solidly for the gap between London and Rio, working with those teams, working with the England netball team for the commies, and at Liverpool Football Club as well. So I got a really broad mix of individual and team sports, and learned loads and loads about the human mind. And if you know the name Steve Peters, then you'll know the chimp paradox. And a lot of runners who I encounter and work with, they all, if they know anything about psychology, know the chimp model, and it really resonates for them. And I set up and practice in 2017 using my own brand and name. I specialize particularly in endurance sports. So, as well as running, I've got a number of triathletes, some of whom are in the UK, some of whom are abroad. I've got clients in Singapore, Hong Kong. So I do work with triathletes, cyclists. I've even had a long distance swimmer, which was fascinating. I've just got off a call with a boxer who's really high level and fascinating to work with. And you'd think, what's the crossover with running? But there's plenty that I could pepper into our conversation. And yeah, like Lewis said, I because I had a business career, I also do sports psychology and coaching for Mindflick, who are Andrew Strauss's company, who do high performance psychology work for the likes of Amazon, Coots, and other big companies. But nearly everyone who works there is a sports psychologist. So as well as that, I find time to do a little bit in the music industry, and I co-wrote the touring manual for musicians who are going on the road, and it's a really high stress, pressure lifestyle. I'm working with a couple of different musicians at the moment. So I'm really across all three disciplines: music, sport, business. And the common thing that threads everything together is performance and coping under pressure. So that's probably the thing that unites all the work that I do, and it's a great life. I really enjoy it, but it keeps me on my toes.
It's really interesting point you made there, Stu, about that the thread of them all together is that, yeah, performing under pressure. And I think often we hear that term in elite sport, but one thing I've realized over the years from working with people at the elite level, right the way down to people who just get into the sport for the very first time, is people at all levels put high levels of pressure on themselves to perform. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Olympic Games, it doesn't matter whether it's somebody's first marathon. We see similar traits and we see similar behaviors, and that pressure that they put on themselves can have such an impact on their performance. And I
Yeah,
guess when you and I first started working together, because I came to you from a business perspective, but also to help with my coaching, it's the same in business, isn't it? And it's the same in coaching. There's pressures of the job that ultimately impact our performance. And that's what you're saying here. It threads across all disciplines, all people, whether it's team, individual, or whether it is business and life.
yeah. It's about high performance mindset, and it's thinking about the things that can both be on one hand really rewarding and exciting. So whether that's running a marathon, whether it's going on stage to perform at a concert or a festival, or whether it's a business person doing a big talk, the sensations that those people go through are exactly the same across those different disciplines. And that's why people come to work with me, because even if it's a musician going on stage, they go, well, you've helped these athletes get ready for an Olympic Games. This is like my Olympic Games that I'm dealing with. Or for a business person delivering a keynote talk, or like the big company speech or whatever, is their Olympics too.
I think there's a misconception as well in the world of, certainly, or there used to be a bit of a stigma around psychology, that people only come to a psych or a sports psych if something's broken. And I hope that that landscape is changing now. I feel like it's becoming a bit more, like you said, a bit more high performance orientated, where people are thinking, actually, this is one of the tools that I can utilize to help improve my performance. So why wouldn't I do it? And I know you're big on this, Stu. You talk a lot about working on the brain fitness, training the brain. I'm massively passionate about it because I've seen the impact it's had on my performance, not just as a runner, as a coach, and now as a business owner. I believe you get out of it what you put into it. But there definitely is more of a focus, I would say, on sports people coming forward and not necessarily asking for help, but wanting to support themselves with their performance through their psychology. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking there about the landscape when I went to archery in 2013 after the London Games, and I think there'd been a bit of a sea change with prominent sports psychologists because it was London and the home games. There was a lot more focus on what was happening, and so radio, telly, online journalists and the public were keen to know about like the team behind the team and who makes our Team GB athletes so successful. Is it just that we've got this golden generation, or is it that there's something else going on? And there was loads of interviews with the likes of Steve. There was interviews with people who were top level coaches. There was detailed analysis that people could dive into, and so people's interest was piqued. And I think there was that fundamental shift away from seeing psychology as only helping people who are broken or damaged. And in particular, we're talking about within the world of sport. But in that time, I was like working at the high end myself. I'd say that I still encountered that within lots of different environments, in football, in rugby, in athletics, where people maybe typically it was either people who were older or who had been in the sport for a long time carried that kind of, I don't need a psychologist to tell me what's right. I know what I'm doing, or just shut it out and quite close-minded. And since I've been doing that, the conversation's changed a lot. You've seen a lot of interest in people talking about mental health in all sorts of parts of life. Last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, and um, in terms of anyone talking about their own mental health, that seems to be encouraged, and the stigma is being broken. It's still there. It's not a complete sea change. But I think what we're tapping into here is looking at normally functioning people, which is the majority of the world. Unfortunately, people are on a spectrum, and there's some people who've got very serious conditions who need more help. And then there's people like me and you, Lewis, who may have a difficult or traumatic time, and they might have a little bit of a dip in their mental health, and they need to go to see a doctor or a psychologist or a counselor. I think for most people, they're quite well functioning, but what's sort of like changed is this idea that you might be a runner and you want to work on your physical fitness, and you could be in tip-top condition, but if your mind's not set right, then what's the point of being absolutely a specimen? And what I like about your coaching, and I saw it from the first moment I knew about New Levels, you were doing a talk which I tuned into for, I can't remember if it's 5K or marathon, and you kind of did your blocks of, you need to do, if you're going to do a big race, you need to cover off this, you need to cover off this, you need to cover off this, and your mindset structure I was watching professionally and as a punter, I guess. And I thought it was really good, really well informed, really educated. And you were talking about like you worked with Chris Thompson and like him, when you were coached by him, and how much of an emphasis that you put on it. And I think again, people like you destigmatizing, demystifying, as well as people like myself, is only helping that. And hopefully today we can give listeners something a bit more tangible that they can go away and actually implement in their training and in their racing, and they can see how much it can help.
Well, that's one of the big aims is to give people a bit of an insight into this, but also give them things that they could potentially go away and work on. And I'm glad that message came across, because when I set New Levels coaching up, it was always with a holistic view of, well, what benefited my own performance that I believe other people should work on. And I was just a big believer in, if you get to the start line, as you described it, as physically in the best shape possible, you're a specimen, you've done everything right. But if you've not worked on the brain, how do you expect it to play ball? How do you expect it to show up for you when it gets tough if you've not worked on that? And that was always my viewpoint on it. And the reason I had that viewpoint on it is because I'd struggled in certain races in the past where my brain had let me down, and I knew I was in physically great shape. And I always say to people, if it was just a physiology test, we'd have the same winners every time,
Mm.
because the physiology, the person with the best physiology and strength would just win. But that isn't how it works, because the brain plays such an important part, whether that's tactical awareness, whether it's being able to stay switched on for a period of time, whether it's being able to dig deep and dig yourself out of holes, particularly in the longer races. So I believe it plays a massive part. You can do all the training in the world, but if you're not mentally in the right state on that particular day, it isn't going to go well for you. And I think a lot more people are recognizing that and being a lot more open to it, thankfully. Before we go on to like digging into a little bit more the detail about the strategies that people could potentially use, and having a conversation around like how you potentially work with people, Stu, I wanted to touch on Steve's chimp paradox, Steve Peters' chimp paradox. A lot of people are familiar with it, some people won't be, some people believe in it, some people maybe don't believe in it, and that's fine. Not one thing works for everybody, and that's true in all walks of life. But I just find, or I certainly found, when Steve spoke openly, or he certainly had the book out, The Chimp Paradox, and then the athletes he worked with spoke openly about that, it was almost like that realization of people like Chris Hoyer, who he was working with at the time, Stephen Gerrard,
Mm.
Vicky Pendleton, coming out and saying, I'm working with this guy and I am vulnerable. I have recognized a bit of a chink in my armor and I'm doing something about it. It almost opened the gates, and all of a sudden it was like this huge flood of people knew about the chimp paradox, knew about Steve Peters,
Mm.
and wanted a little bit of that, of what they were seeing. And is that where you then came into the fold of, like, from 2013 onwards, there was just this big shift around high performing teams, high performing people, but even general public wanting to work more on this?
Yeah, I think it obviously gave permission, and maybe the element was everyone knew it. It was a bit of an unspoken secret, or less than secret, that you got to show up mentally tuned up on race day. I think the one caveat I'd say here for listeners, regardless of whether someone who's a devotee and thinks that like working on the mind is the best thing since sliced bread and they're all ears, to someone who's deeply cynical or somewhere in between, is we recognize that everyone who's participated in races, trains the socks off, and maybe hasn't done any psych work specifically, either with a practitioner or doing some lessons online or watching stuff and podcasts and that, whatever. Everyone who has competed does have a base level of mental fitness. This is a term I try and go to. And they use skills even if they don't know they're doing them, or they don't know what the names of them are that are doing them. So I want to kind of just be absolutely clear. It's not like if you've not done specific work, you're not mentally fit. There's some people who very fortunately just naturally have a bit of a gift for, without any kind of intervention, knowing how to wring a performance out. But they are generally quite in the minority. And even those kind of people would probably say, yeah, I could probably do with a little bit more. And, I've worked with people at all levels, from the very elite top finishers in marathons and other distance races, down to people who are like not quite first timers. But I had a lady who was desperate to break the 5 hours for the marathon. And that's a really broad mix if you're looking at top finishes for the marathon to someone doing 5. And both the people at the top and thinking about that individual in particular, they all got something from it. They all got things that they could use and implement. So I think the message today is like, one, you've got a base level, and don't feel that, I think, or Lewis thinks, that you don't have a good repertoire already. What we want you to do is tap into what you've got already and maximize it.
I think that's a really good point, Stu, especially around how people are maybe more competent at that, but they could still brush up on it. Absolutely. I feel like everybody always has room for improvement. I've said this on a podcast before, one of the great coaches who George Gandy, the late great George Gandy,
Mm.
who's at Loughborough, he used to say, show me the finished article and I'll show you somebody who's finished. And I just really resonated with that. If you think you've done everything, there's probably more that you can do, but it does come more naturally to some people. But what I would say with that is, a lot of those people, when you speak to them, they don't often realize how much work they're doing mentally on themselves. And they are doing it from, like, speaking to themselves in training, like a bit of positive self-talk. They're sometimes filling in a training diary, which can relate to journaling. They're sometimes doing some self-reflections within that training diary. They're coming up with mantras that they sometimes put into races. So they're doing a lot of the stuff, a lot of the tools that we can look at. They often just don't realize they're doing it already.
Mm.
Um, But right to the bottom end of that spectrum, there's some people who often feel a little bit lost with this as well. Like, where do I start? I don't have a clue about any of this. And I feel like I've lost all self-confidence, lost self-belief, and I don't know what strategy there are out there to help me. So what I'm going to do here is almost go, well, where did we start? I didn't come to you broken, but as somebody who came into your world, and people do come into your world regularly, what is that starting point for most people? What are you looking at? And then what strategies can we start to look at and put in place?
Okay, so I mean, I'll go kind of gold standard, and then we can work backwards to the man in the street. So if someone came to me and we did 10, 12 sessions for argument's sake, I'd be doing a bit of a background check on their history. Have they ever had anything really, deeply traumatic in their life, or have they needed counseling or therapy, or something like a loss of a family member or what have you, just to sort of understand how they're built on that most foundational level. Then I might look at, say, okay, and where's been that's the downside. Where's the plus points of like where you've been successful and happy and content in your life? And that could be around personal stuff they've done. It could be professional, whether that's work, whether that's sport. What are the highlights? So what were you doing right at that time? What did it feel like? What were you implementing? And we kind of like get a bit of a picture. And you could do a self audit. Anyone could do this of like, where am I at right now compared to where I was a few years ago or when I was younger? When I've been thriving, what are the things that I've been doing that have helped push the needle? Maybe what are the things that I've done which are not helping to push the needle? And we're all human. Sometimes we overeat. Sometimes we might hit the drink a little bit too much. We switch off. We're not really thinking about what we're doing and coasting in life or drifting in life. But if you're doing something like running, it's quite good because it kind of provides structure and discipline. And, we'll use that as the lens that we're having this conversation about. And if people are lacking self-confidence in their running, whether that's in training or in races, you've got plenty that you can be really proud about. If you're doing 5 sessions a week, you're showing up, you're doing your long run, you're doing some threshold tempo, you might be doing some reps and some easy running. You've got a base there to work from. You might not have had results recently that you're really content and happy with, but then that's the motivating switch that maybe you need to kind of move forward. And it's like saying, well, did you do an analysis? Lewis was talking about reflecting in the training diary. Have you properly analyzed that race that didn't go so well? Look at like what was happening maybe in the week or two before the race, the day before, and think about, I've had an athlete where they've said, oh, like I trained really well, and the last week before the race, like work slammed me, and I was so tired going into the race from that week, it kind of threw my result out. Well, there's an explanation. But then often those kind of individuals can be quite tough on themselves, and they're saying, well, I've done all the training, so I should get the result. And it's like, well, let's stand back from it, get the context. And in every situation like that, you could say, okay, so you've had good training, maybe the week before wasn't optimal. What was going really well for you? What did you do really well? Pick out the best bits. What was the stuff which really was difficult or hard, the less bits? If you could change it all again, what would you do differently? And then begin to slowly build up. Like maybe I would suggest look at something like, could you go and do maybe a park run and like just go in with no expectation, go and run it, see how you do without the pressure, because that's where people tend to fall over. Go and see how you could do it at a park run, and then like be analytical after that park run and see, all right, well, actually, I did better than I thought. I started really well. I maybe dropped off in the middle. I finished really well, and like I actually feel much better. And then you can begin to start to look at the things that we might talk about later. So I think start to kind of be a bit more analytical on yourself and your own performance, but with a real compassion and objectivity. Almost be like Lewis, looking at your situation and say, what would Lewis say here? Would he be saying, oh, you let yourself down there, or you weren't fulfilling your potential? He probably wouldn't ever be that harsh, but he'd always be looking to pick out the nuggets. So maybe that's what you need to do.
That's a really good point, because I always say, when you're self-reflecting, try and think of the advice you would give somebody else rather than the advice you're giving yourself, or the compliments you're giving somebody else, as opposed to the negatives that you're giving yourself. Because quite naturally, the brain goes to the negatives when it's our own self-performance and self-reflections. Whereas when it's somebody else, you always look for those nuggets. You know, you see it at the end of a marathon, people walk over, oh, how was it today? Oh, you know, it didn't quite go well. I still got myself over the line. And then, you know, an hour later, their friend finishes and they've got themselves over the line as well. And they'll go to their friend and say, oh, well done for getting over the line. What an amazing achievement. And
Mm.
you stood there listening, thinking, well, you didn't have that same reflection yourself. You know, it's interesting. So often those reflections that you would give and those compliments you give somebody else, think about writing those down yourself. But it is a big part of it where people don't self-analyze. And this is the crossover that I want to get in here. I came actually to work with you, Stu, to help me with my coaching and to help me with my business. And that's what we worked on together. But the first thing you got me to do was self-analyze, like to go away and have a look at where am I spending my time? What am I passionate about? What's going well? What did I feel is not going well? And a lot of that required work from my side to go and sit down and actually do some work. And I think this is one of my biggest messages with sports psych, as we all know too well, you and I, for sure, is that if people aren't willing to do the work and go away and be reflective and put that work in, it's probably not going to help them. There's got to be an element of somebody saying, I'm buying into this, I'm going to do this and that. And they can do that themselves, or they can do it with support. I felt like I just needed a bit of support and guidance with it, which is why I obviously came to you. But I know you said to me, you know, the best results that people get out of this are exactly the same as coaching. You will see the same, Lou. You said to me, people who buy into that coaching process get the results usually,
Mm.
90% of the time. And I'm sure it's exactly the same with sports psych, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And if you change the words and the language around and think about it, I use this term mental fitness. We talked about that before. If you were going to do strength and conditioning fitness, to complement your running, if you pop along to the gym once or twice and you do a nice little workout and you feel great about yourself, it's probably not going to have an impact on your running. But if you go and do a 12 to 16 week structured training block and you stay injury free, you're probably going to convert something in a race scenario. It might not be the best ever performance, but you're probably going to feel better afterwards. You're probably going to do as well as you can. The only thing is, say you did well in that race after 12 or 16 weeks, and you said, oh, well, I've nailed it now because I did a bit of strength conditioning, and then I'm not going to bother with that next time. Well, you're not likely to get the same input, and you just need to keep it up. And I often say to people, look, we lead busy lives. There's this perception, maybe whether it's strength work or psych work or even nutrition. Oh, I can't be bothered because it feels like effort and I'm already busy and I just want to run. Fine, it's absolutely fine. And the thing I should point out is like I know plenty of successful runners who don't really do much in the way of strength and core. It's not like everyone has to do it. There are some people who can just run and get great results and they're happy with. Fine. And it's the same with psych. You don't have to do this. So if it's not for you, that's fine. But if you are into it, like I always say, if you're psych curious, then by all means start to sort of do what we're saying here, but keep it up a bit little and often is better than one big hit and then going 4 weeks, 5 weeks without anything. In the same way, if you went to the gym, did a big workout and left it a month and went back into the gym a month later, oh, I've done another big session, leave it another month, you're not going to get the gains.
Comes back to that consistency, doesn't it? And consistency of everything and making sure that we are keeping it in there consistently. I think it's a massive part of it. Josh Kerr, who won the world champs last year over men's 1500 meters, beat Jakob Ingebrigtsen. He spoke about, and I've really liked it. He said, "Look, I've not done anything spectacular this year training wise, but I've been very consistent and I've applied myself consistently to my training program." But then what he said, he was psych curious. He said, I've also been working on my mental fitness and I've been working with a sports psych over the past year, which I feel like has made a massive difference. So he's saying my training hasn't changed too much physically. But this year I'm just on another level. And that's because I've applied myself consistently to some different areas. And I always go back to the point he made in the final where they said, what were you thinking down that home straight? And he said, I was just going back to my mantras that I'd worked on with the sports psych, and my mantra was cadence, 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 cadence. And he was just repeating it to himself to make sure he was focusing on the process and not the outcome. And that leads me nicely on to the next point, Stu, is I think when I worked with you, one of my biggest learnings on my reflections was that I was bought so much into the process, I almost forgot about the outcome that I'd come in to look for. So you
Mm,
got me so bought into the processes that I was working on each week and working on these little tasks and different things that I wasn't really focused on the end outcome. I was just being in the moment and doing what you asked of me. And in the end, I got to the outcome I wanted to. In running, we often see the opposite effect, or certainly in most sport arenas. We get so fixated on the outcome, we tend to either forget about the processes or we don't focus on them as well. And that too much focus on the outcome can often become overwhelming. And even with like a nutrition plan, you sometimes see that people become so obsessed with losing weight, they forget about like just focusing on the process.
mm.
And that's one thing that you did really well with me personally. And I think it does lend itself to psychology, obviously. Um, but I really want to emphasize that importance of even when you're training, if you focus on the processes, you're more likely to get the outcome. Now, there's going to be a lot of psych behind that, and I'm going to put you on the spot and say, well,
Mm.
why is that the case?
Well, as in why process influences outcome.
Yes.
Well, I guess it's probably having a belief effect. You know, like I was saying, if you are um, consistently doing a little bit and just topping up the reminder to self around, good mentality in training, having a focus when you're at the track, trying to be less harsh as a critic on how you've done on a rep or in a tempo session or whatever, and actually almost been more like a coach to yourself, like we were saying earlier, and you do that on a regular basis, it shifts the perspective and the belief effect that, oh, like maybe I've got a bit more here within me and I'm doing well and I'm ticking off that work. And I've seen it in people who've like had, pretty good results, but they're disappointed with the outcome because they don't feel they converted what they put into training into a race. And then they come to me and they're like, can you look at what I was doing before? And I don't look at the numbers. I don't look at like, how quickly they can do a lap or what volume they were doing, because a lot of the time they've generally got that locked down. But it's a lot more like, well, what was it like being around you at training and in that training cycle, and what was going on in the rest of your life, and try to help pull them out and get that helicopter view. And it's like, well, let's top up what you can do in this next block that you're doing. And like I said, I try and generally train people who I work with just to be more switched on. So it's like when you're going down to the track every week, you do that session, come what may. What's it like being in the car with you? If you're on your own, what's it like being in your head in the car on the way to the track? Are you just playing loops in your head of like how bad work is and like that person's annoying you? Or are you thinking, right, I'm going training, I'm going to have a really good session tonight. Even if I feel tired, I'm going to maximize this. It's a 10K style session. So the point of the session is that, I need to be consistent on every rep, and like, I might find it hard. So I'm going to use this focus to get through every rep. And at the end, we can go home and, it'll have been tough, but we'll have had a good session. If you think like, the two different examples I gave there, the person who's having that little conversation just to prime themselves before they go to the track is probably going to, well, they're certainly going to enjoy it more. And two, in the long run, they'll probably have a better belief about their ability and how well they could do in their race.
It's a fantastic example because I can just relate to it so much of being in that car and, picturing the person who's getting like road rage because they're a little bit late and that sort of thing. And if we go back to the chimp paradox, their chimp is going insane at them. And it comes back to they're not managing that very well, and they're not, parking the chimp or having a conversation with them and recognizing that certain things are out of their control, as opposed to the person who's in full control and maybe is still late, but has managed it well and said, you know what, I'm going to be late. That doesn't affect my session. I'll get there in good time. So I'll have time to warm up. I'm still going to have an enjoyable session. And you can just see it in your head as we're talking through this. Like, you can see what the outcome is going to look like for most people. Majority of the time, there might be a few exceptions. And I've seen it. I've seen it in training. I've seen the person who comes to training stressed. I see it a lot at Loughborough. They come stressed from work. Oh, I've had a terrible day at work. And I just think to myself, in fact, what I've started to do, and again, it comes down to some of the work I've done with you, I'll say to them, just go and decompress, just take yourself off for your own warm up, just go and collect your thoughts, just chill a little bit. come back in. Maybe don't even do your full warm. Just go and take 5 minutes over there just to decompress a little bit. Because back to our earlier point here, Stu, is like physically they're ready to do the session. They're fit, they're well, they're primed, they're good, but they're just not in that right mental state to take on something hard. So it's my job as a coach there to recognize that and say, well, physically, doesn't matter what warm up I give them. It's more of that now, that mental application of saying, just go and chill a little bit here. And we could go on about examples of this, and people will be sat there thinking, God, yeah, I totally resonate to this. So I guess, what about looking at some strategies as to when these sort of things happen, where maybe people feel like they are losing a little bit of control, or they're in a bit of a bad mood and they don't feel they can pull themselves around? What sort of things can they be doing or thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because it's sort of like I can imagine someone who's a bit like that would be listening to this and saying, "Well, it's all right for you two. You've not got the pressure of this job and X, Y, Z." And we've all got things in our lives which test our limits and really can grind our gears. I'm not saying you and I or other people are perfect. We've all got to work with the biology and the life that we've got. And really, it's about making a decision about how you're going to maximize it, and also think about there'll be people here of different levels of ability and capability. And all I want for all athletes is to maximize their potential in their docket. And if they do really well, they might move to the next docket up, whatever that looks like. And it's a hard one because we all at different points get different levels of stress. But the one thing that I would say most people can recognize is if you want to have a successful performance in any sport, you need to have those stress levels in check. And the more you're doing distance running, the more stressed you are and you're having to compete over the longer distance, the less beneficial that's going to be. You know it, I know it. And it can be, I would look to turn it around from like, this might be something I'm a bit more susceptible to. I'm a bit of a stress head when I let myself go. And that requires a lot of reflection from that person, like you were saying before, to be honest and say, maybe I'm not managing myself and this chimp stress head I've got with me. I can't change the nature of the stress head, but I can try and calm that down and maximize my training. And so, like you've said, you could reflect and journal out some of that frustration. If you've got a confidant or an ally, or even, dare I say, a coach, you could, verbally express what's on your mind. And like, you don't need to bombard Lewis and give him half an hour as a diatribe. He's got better things to do with his time. But I'm sure if you really pushed him and said, look, I'm having a really hard time at the moment, and I'm not in the right place, and I want to do well in training, and I want to do well in racing, he'd be listening to you. He would be there and go, let's have 5 minutes, or after this session, let's go for coffee. Use the resources. It might not be Lewis, it might be a girlfriend, a boyfriend, or a partner, uh, um, a parent or whoever, like just try and use what you've got resources around you, but also take that responsibility and say, right, maybe I'm not perfect, maybe I didn't execute how I wanted to last time, how can I do it better next time? And then just take a slower, more progressive approach in whatever you're doing. And it might be that you only need to do a tweak job rather than a full overhaul. Again, it's becoming much more aware of your specific needs and the needs of the discipline you're doing. Because what someone who is doing an 800 needs compared to the marathon is chalk and cheese.
And absolutely. And what I love about this is there's so many similar traits across the board. And as you say, that the mental demands of one event are so different, but in the same instances as well, there's a lot of similarities in what we can do to control things. And the example I'm going to give here is, and Gemma loves you for this, Stu, by the way, I must say. Quite often when you've got home, you're a bit hot-headed or whatever, the person that you naturally take things out on is the person at home who you're closest to. Like you say, that confident because you unleash. But one thing that I've been better at over the last sort of 18 months is explaining when I feel like that. Just, saying to Gemma, look, oh God, something's gone wrong. And then talking through it with each other first, rather than bottling it up myself and being quite reactive and her having to say to me, what's up with you? Like, why are you being reactive? Because we're not perfect. We do bottle things up, but just having that conversation. And it comes all the way back to, for me, learning about yourself and
Mm,
recognizing that was something that I was doing. And that was step one, was like recognizing I do this. This is a trait of mine. And, if I go a little bit deeper, where does that come from? And even going like back to childhood and different things and thinking, okay, I maybe recognize where that comes from a little bit. But recognizing it was step number one. And the message here for our listeners is that a lot of these things that you find out about yourself, if you're willing to learn and do something about it, it's often when you get the positive outcome. So don't see it as a negative. It's easy to look at yourself and think it's a negative, but
mm,
why not try and turn that into a positive? And it is being harsh about yourself, and we're not perfect, absolutely not, and nobody ever will be. But if we learn from our mistakes, as you've just highlighted, Stu, like, okay, that was a mistake I made, but how can I learn from that? You will become better and you will improve. And that's got nothing to do with any result, any time. That's just about being who you want to be as a person, which is another thing that you got me to work on, which
yeah.
is
I'd say that you could sum up what you just very eloquently described there in a real life situation people can get their head around, as a bit of a motto of self-awareness is a superpower. And
love that.
people are kind of busy going through life with their own XYZ going on, maybe looking inward. And I just encourage you to sort of be a little bit more self-aware. It's always hard, and possibly we might all say, God, if that person was a bit more self-aware, we've all done it. But are we good at doing that ourselves? And also coming back into that point we said before, the chimp mindset can be very, very negative. Don't tear yourself to shreds like by being self-aware. We need you to get the balance right between, yeah, you've got things you can work on and improve, but also don't neglect all the good stuff you're doing. And that's probably the hardest bit I find people have to try and pull out. They could list 10 million things wrong with themselves, but find one thing that they're really proud of or they're good about. It can always be a bit harder to dig that out.
That's a fascinating point, really, because I think we're so good at being our own worst critic. Like you just hear people tearing shreds off themselves, and when you ask them to think of something positive about themselves, it's really, really hard for them to do. And I often think like, is that going on in people's minds as well when it gets really tough in, say, like a marathon or an Ironman? Is that the self-talk we're giving ourselves? Do
Yeah,
you think
and
it is?
and exactly. And I mean, let's just stand back for a moment and let's zoom out. What is endurance sport ultimately? It's an exercise of exhausting yourself. And we know from a psychology perspective that when we're pushing ourselves at our limit over the long haul, your attention and your ability to think gets narrowed. So the things that you've got in your head, if you've got, it's like, bad stuff in, bad stuff out, good stuff in, good stuff out is sort of a way I look at it. Um, and so you could look at like pushing yourself hard in life and in your races, and then like you'll have seen at Lewis that people under pressure at the end of something, they're exhausted, the self-talk they've got is really negative, and it's an understandable default position to get to. But if you could just turn that around ever so slightly, so it's less critical, less negative, it can have a whole massive impact on your performance. So another adage I always stick by is, you don't need to make massive gains you can get small gains can have a big advantage for you in whatever realm. We're not just talking here about running, training, that side of it. So if you can change that narrative ever so slightly, and that's why we're saying finding those good bits. It's a horrible thing to be in a very long race and feeling negative. And I'm sure Lewis's philosophy is one of, I want to coach you and make you better as a runner and give you the times that will get you really excited. But I want you to have a good time along the way. I don't want this to be like a suffer fest.
And that underpins our values at New Levels Coaching as a whole. Like when our coaches come on board, and we spend a lot of time with our coaches as a team working with them. And I say, look, this business was built on some solid foundations and values. And one of those is like, we're not going to break people to get to a start line. That isn't what we're about. Like we want people to enjoy their training. We want people to enjoy the process, and the outcome to us is secondary. Now, I know that sounds mad because most people come with an outcome driven goal. But we just strongly believe that if we get that process right as a company, and our coaches work on that with people so that they enjoy the process and they go through that process together, the outcome will come. And there are so many examples of when that does happen. But I love the point you make about when we are stressed, our like, and we are stressed when we're running. We're at physical stress when we're at the end of a 20 miles into a marathon. God almighty, like you're so tired. And that almost like that tunnel vision comes on. And if you've been feeding yourself negative thoughts all the time in training and in life, then they're just going to come out to play, aren't they?
Yeah.
I've got a book in front of me here, which I read before before we worked together. But I know you've done a lot of work with Matt Fitzgerald. I'm holding
Mm.
up to the screen, Brain Training for Runners. I really like this book because one thing that I learned in there was a little bit about how we apply ourselves in training mentally will come when we're stressed in races, will start to come out. So that positive self-talk in training, training your brain to be better at that. Our coping strategies are so, so important. And
Mm.
I try and work on that with the athletes I work with. I'm not a psych, but I've done enough work for you, with you and reading the books to realize that this stuff is really, really important.
Yeah, and it's great you mentioned Matt because there's a secondary point. So what he's maybe spent a lot of time in that book articulating, and more particularly in his other book, Run Like a Pro, which I try and get all my athletes to read because what it does there, and this is why it's advantageous working with Lewis, who's been at that elite level, is a lot of more, dare I say, high amateur and just general runners. They go into their athletics with the best of intentions and they give everything to it, and they're working their socks off. There's no um, negativity from us around your thinking about your ability to apply yourself. What the book Run Like a Pro does, and I'm sure it does in there, Matt went to train with Ben Rosario's team. We just talking about him before the session, and he basically got the gift of a lifetime for any runner of any ability. He got to train with an elite squad for 16 weeks, and he was going in thinking he had quite a lot of his game dialed in. And the book's really good at sort of blowing apart what even someone who's quite self-aware thought was pro level. And that could be ranging from the food that they ate to the aftercare that they do post running. For me, obviously, with my lens, I was looking at the psychology side, and he said the one thing that really stood out is just how level those elite runners were. And I mean that in a very emotional sense.
Mm.
They obviously did get emotional at times. They weren't like robots, but he said that like one bad session didn't like make them miserable for a week or two. Equally, if they nailed a session and it was brilliant, they weren't dining out on it for a fortnight either. They literally took each session by session and like took it for what it was. If it wasn't so good, park it, go to the next one. If it was great, fantastic, chuck that up, get to the next one. And I think there's so much all athletes at all levels can learn from that. If you want to run like a pro, think like a pro. It's that, and that's what pros think like. Not all of them, and some will do it better than others, but I think generally that's a great message I'd want people to walk away from this conversation with.
Well, I'm going to echo it because one of my greatest coaches, Alex Haynes, who was really good at working on my mindset with me, despite not being a psychologist, he used to say to me, look, we need to avoid the big ups and downs. He said, we've just got to avoid going up here. I'm pointing up high here, and we've got to avoid going down here really low. And I would say, Stu, you have just identified the biggest difference between a professional athlete, certainly one who's having success, or certainly an elite level athlete, and your everyday athlete or runner or triathlete who does this for fun. The biggest difference we see from a coaching perspective is that they blow themselves up if they have a bad session. Whereas, as you quite rightly pointed out, the more elite athletes recognize that that is part of the process. That isn't always going to be the case. I'm going to hit every session and I'm not going to react badly to that. I'm going to observe, I'm going to reflect, and I'm going to have a look at what I could have maybe done better. But I'm also not going to take the session next week that goes well and go and tell everyone about it on social media, put it on Strava, do a 6-page write-up about it, think I've made it now because one session's gone well. It's just not like that. They are, as you said, they are very level, very level. And that is, in a nutshell, one of the biggest differences we see. And I'll say it this way, it's again back to your point you made earlier about us not being very good at complimenting ourselves. It's usually worse the lower it goes down. So if it's a bad session, we are massively critical. Oh, I'm unfit. I've lost all fitness. And my general reaction as a coach is what, in 3 days? Like, how do you lose fitness in 3 days? It's scientifically impossible. But that's the kind of the catastrophe theory, right? Is like they catastrophize this, whereas when it goes well, even some people will still pick out the negatives within that. So I think that message you just said is a brilliant one for our listeners to get their head around and honestly have a self-reflective moment. Do you fall into that category? Because I know a lot of people do, and I'm sure you've seen it with the people you work with too.
Yeah, and even when I was doing more running, I fell into the trap myself, and I'm sure you did when you were at your top level. And all of this is a learning experience, and I think if you go into working on your mental fitness with a open and gentle mind, and I mean that in the sense of like you're not going to like beast yourself, and you're not going to expect high standards of yourself, but like inch along and try and do a bit as much as you can week by week for your next marathon or ultra or whatever you're training for. Even if you're not working with a psych or you're using a particular method, but you're tracking it and you're kind of keeping an eye on yourself and your performance and how you're thinking along the way, it will be a different training block than you've ever had before.
And I think I want to kind of piece all this together to finalize it because I think it's just come to a really nice point as a whole around there are crossovers across any sport, any discipline we do, but also in life in general. And you just said there, if you are working on your mindset, if you are working on your mental fitness, I believe there's a lot of crossover into everyday life too. I've seen it firsthand. I know you're doing a lot of work around that, Stu, and you constantly do work around that. But people who are working on their mental fitness with their running, that might have a positive impact on their life in general, and vice versa. If you're working on your mental fitness with your life in general or around work, that could also have a positive impact on your sport as well.
100%. We're not talking about take yourself off to the funny farm, as people used to say, or going in for deep therapy. We're really getting you to just do a little bit, in the same way sometimes you see these great core programs of like just do a little bit every day and see what impact that has on your running. If you took a similar stance, it's always interesting to see working with athletes where they come in through the door. I want to get faster. I want to get a PB. I want to get a BQT, whatever it might be. And then like you work with them and they give themselves. And I'm very fortunate that nearly everyone I've ever worked with, that I'm never having to push them to do the work, because it's like generally I think people self-select out of working with me because I'm like, this could be tough and I'm going to be with you the whole way, but if you're half-hearted, then come back later. And that might sound harsh from my perspective working with someone, but I don't want to take money off people who are kind of half in, half out, in the same way for you with your coaching. But yeah, I think if people will get surprised because they'll do some of this stuff, they'll work on the mentality for running, and then they'll see something happen. And it always varies. It's not always the same thing, but they'll see some transferability into another part of their life. It could be their relationships. It could be the way they talk to themselves and the way they handle stress, or the way that they're just a bit kinder to themselves in their day-to-day living. It could be anything. So I think you might look at it as investment purely to get faster, which, if that's what drives you, then fantastic. But again, if you're open-minded, you might see some other benefits beyond the racetrack.
And that's a great way of looking at it and rounding it off. I always go back to the point of the energy systems because I'm a coach and we're always looking at energy systems. And some people believe there's this tap that, if you're going to do a VO2 max session, that you only work in VO2 max. And that's not how it works. All the energy systems are working collaboratively at the same time. And you don't just switch one off and switch another one on. And I see it the same with psychology. Just because you're working on your mental skills and your mindset in running, it doesn't mean that doesn't also apply to life. It doesn't just switch off. The minute you stop running, it doesn't mean all the work that you've done in your mindset and running switches off in everyday life. I think there's a huge crossover. And the more you do it, the more you practice it, the more it does have a crossover and a positive impact. And I'm speaking from personal experience. Again, I'm far from perfect, by the way, but I'm just speaking from it. And it has improved me as a person. It has improved me as a coach. Definitely, I've seen the results. And I've seen it have that first-hand impact as well on some of the athletes that I also work with who've gone down that route, who've put the work in and invested in themselves, which is ultimately it comes back down to, which is what you were saying, doesn't it, Stu? If you are prepared to invest in yourself, and you see it as an investment in yourself, whether that's to run a time or to improve yourself as a whole, you will generally get the results if you put the work in.
Yeah, nothing's guaranteed. It's not binary, invest X amount of time, effort, and money there, and you'll get Y, benefit. It doesn't work like that. But probability wise, I'd say definitely everything I've seen in over 10 years of doing this across different sports with lots of different people of all different mindsets and where they are mentally when they start to where they finish. The general trend is the needle goes in the right direction.
Amazing. Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners, Stu, before we wrap it up? Because I feel like that's a really good point. And amazingly, we've got through like the points that I sent you across. We didn't, by the way, we didn't script any of this. It's just been a really good, open, off the cuff conversation because both Stu and I agreed that that's how we work best.
Mhm.
And we wanted to keep it that way. And I just sent him over a couple of points of which we've ticked them all off, which is
Mhm.
amazing. But I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. I always feel like I learn a little bit along the way as well. But is there anything you want to leave our listeners with, Stu?
Yeah, I guess if you're probably listening to this, you're somewhat sight curious, because why would you give an hour of your time to listen to us flap our gums otherwise? Um, but if you want to kind of maybe do a bit more research, as I said, a brilliant book to start with might be Run Like a Pro by Matt Fitzgerald and Ben Rosario. I obviously got to give a small plug to Noel Brick and myself's book, The Psychology of Running. Again, if you go on Amazon or any other Google it, you'll find us there. And although there isn't actually a set method that we have in that book about how you can work on your mindset, there's plenty in there that covers how to enjoy your running more, some strategies and tools and techniques with how to cope with running, fast running, how to help yourself in training and racing, and definitely, if you read it with that mindset of how can I use this to improve my enjoyment of running and my performance in running, you'll find the nuggets. You don't need me to signpost you. And yeah, I just encourage you. Probably the last thing I'd say around what we're talking about today is Lewis has touched on having a training journal, and I'm amazed at the amount of people who I meet of all levels who don't really keep a track of what they do. And at the very minimal, they might say, "Well, I keep a record of my runs and times and splits, and that's it." I just encourage you kind of add in a little bit about how it was on a mental side, even just one column, and stick in a couple of words after you've done different sessions, and then see how it looks. And that might be a good point. Get if you want to get improving in your running and potentially the psych or both, just invest a tiny bit every time, just topping up that diary, and then you can go back and track your journey, see how far you've come.
Before I go into my closing point, I'm going to elaborate on Stu's last point there because over the last week it's become a bugbear of mine, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what I mean about the training log. I work with athletes who potentially don't update their training logs as much as they should do when it comes to me. And I've been logging into Strava and having a look at how much they update their Strava and tell the world about their training, but don't necessarily tell their coach about their training, which I find fascinating. So have a think about what that training log looks like and the purpose behind it and why you're doing that. You know, it's great if it's on Strava for the world to see, as long as you're using it in the right way. But there are other tools out there that you can use, and I would fully get behind Stu here and say, make sure you are doing it because it is such a useful tool that is often free or very, very cheap to do. And it's a great way of being reflective and being able to look back on the things that you've done and learn from what you've done over a period of time. So yes, I will echo that, Stu. So good, that's a really good point to leave on. My final point is not just about the books, because that's a great place to start. You know, yes, and I'll put those in the show notes as to where you can find those, but it is a really good place to start if you are site curious. But also, if you've enjoyed this, you found it useful, and you think someone else will benefit from it, then please share it with them, not just for our benefit for sharing the podcast, but genuinely, if you think somebody maybe is like curious or is struggling a little bit, then please share it with them, because I think it is an important point and they will get some benefit out of this conversation, or they may hear about the books and then go and pick those books up, and that could benefit them. And I think it's really important, especially when it comes to mental health and mental well-being. So if you feel like somebody will benefit from this conversation, please do share it, not just from our perspective, but see it from their perspective as well.
Excellent.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Stu. Really appreciate it. And thanks for the time, and thanks for your patience with the technology issues at the start.
That's fine, mate. That's fine. It's great to spend some time just talking about this stuff. And I know that, you know, you in a phrase I always use, you eat your own dog food on this. So if people say, "Ah, you're pontificating from on high," Lewis does the work as well. So it's he's not just saying you have to do it or you should do it.
Appreciate that, Stu. Appreciate that. Well, thanks again for joining us. If you've tuned in, hope you've enjoyed the episode as much as I have. I've loved it. We're back in a couple of weeks with a couple of special episodes as we go into the European Mountain Running Champs, which New Levels Coaching have some representatives at for the very first time. So I'm super excited about that. But for now, go away, enjoy your training, and make sure that you're not neglecting your mental training as well. Thanks, Stu, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, Lewis.